Good afternoon. Welcome to our event for today. It's called Mythbusting the American Revolution. So just a little context about the American Revolution. Oh, before I begin, if you would please, if you have not yet already, there's a bright green sign-up sheet on each table. If you would please sign in so that we can track attendance. So a little context about the American Revolution. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out on April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord. A little over, a year later, the colonies had declared independence and began referring to themselves as the United States, no longer the colonies. The American Revolution functioned unlike other revolutions, especially the French, in the sense that although we see one government replaced with another, there was no divisive civil war in the midst of revolution. And many of the men who held positions of political and economic authority before Lexington and Concord held positions of political and economic authority after the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which ended the conflict. But a revolution is a revolution, and this one ushered in, eventually, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We did not have an absolutist monarchy. We were different. As with any great historical event, however, it is the job of historians and students of history to parse myth from reality. The American Revolution is no different. And a lot of this has to do with human beings. I often tell students that we are natural storytellers. For centuries, humans have passed down oral stories and histories, especially before written languages, and in spite of wars, political chaos, and illiteracy, stories remained the way humans connected with their civilization, sharing values, and telling tales of heroes and acts of bravery. But every story can be different, depending on the storyteller. Hence, the problem for historians in general. What can we prove with evidence, and what is just artistic embellishment from an enthusiastic storyteller? Luckily, we have two of our wonderful Northeast campus history instructors here today to give us some insight into the American Revolution. What was the revolution about? Who were the founding fathers? And what was that midnight ride of Paul Revere? All of that is truth, right? We shall see. So without further ado, here are James Hathcock and Samantha Elkins to myth bust the revolution for us all.
All right, well, thank you, Sarah. That was a very good introduction. Thank you. All right, so my name is Dr. James Hathcock. I actually see some familiar faces in the room. Some of my students are here today. Yeah, there you are. Okay. So what I'm going to look at as far as myth busting is this idea that the revolution was about democracy or creating a democratic state. And as I get into that, I think the first thing I want to say there is what the American Revolution did is it set up the possibility for democracy going forward. So I think what I'm really trying to get at here is that it wasn't fought for a democratic state, but eventually that democratic state did emerge. But that took quite a time, quite a few decades to get to an actual democratic state. Okay, so I guess the first question is, what is democracy? Does anybody want to take a shot at that? What do you think democracy is? No takers? Yeah, go ahead over there, yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's an old wooden ship.
No, that's not. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, power to the people, rule of the people, something like that, yeah. What feels like a lifetime ago, I remember a professor of mine at the University of North Texas, Go Mean Green. He told us that democracy was one citizen, one vote. That kind of made sense to me, but then I thought, 10-year-olds are citizens and they don't have the right to vote, so I don't know, it's a perplexing little thing. But when I looked at the dictionary, it tells us that it's a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. So at the time of the American Revolution, the only people who really had the right to vote in what we'll call the colonial age, this is like before 1776, were adult white male property holders. Any of you have ever taken my first half American history class, I'm always writing on the board AWM with a dollar bill sign, and that stands for adult white male property holders. They were the only ones who were allowed that right to vote, and a lot of that goes back to this idea of paying taxes. And when you study the American Revolution, taxes are a big thing, right? No taxation without representation, a lot of that kind of stuff. So these individuals were the ones who actually owned the land. Through that land, they had wealth. That land gave them the ability to grow crops like tobacco, rice, sugar, things like that. And it was also something that the colonial governments themselves could tax. So if you were a property holder, you were paying taxes to, say, the colony of Virginia or the colony of New York, you had the right to vote because, as they put it, you had a stake in that society. You should have some say in how that society is run because you're paying taxes to that government. Now, kind of getting into the no taxation without representation, but not completely. So there was this idea that the British, they wouldn't tax their colonies directly throughout most of the colonial age. There's some hiccups under a guy named James II where he tried some things that didn't quite work. Then you get into the age of King George III, the Stamp Act and things like that. But this idea of no taxation without representation, you say something like the colonies didn't have to pay taxes to the British, and then maybe people think, well, colonials didn't pay taxes. But that's not a true statement in and of itself. They did pay taxes to their colonial governments because that was taxation with representation. If you were an adult white male property holder, a guy who paid taxes and you had a stake in that society, you elected those people to what was called the colonial assemblies. They represented you, and they could do all manner of things to you, such as tax you. But that would have been taxation with representation. And the fact that you were being taxed, you were being represented, that also meant that then you should have that right to vote as well. But when you get to the revolution itself, you know, they had the ability to change the world in those moments. They really, truly did. They had broken away from the British Empire. They were rewriting the books if they wanted to. And it was just the adult white male property holders who held that right to vote. But when you break away from the British, you could have changed everything, but they stuck with adult white male property holders being the only ones who had the right to vote. They could have given the right to vote to indigenous people, to women, to various other groups. But they chose instead to stick with what they knew, that the rich white men in the colonies should be the only ones that had the right to vote. Okay, so let's see, the consent of the governed, that's something that's in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, when he's talking about the consent of the governed, he's bringing up this idea that all governments have to have the consent of those who it's ruling over. Now, it's being written to a king, and you can just imagine King George III reading a sentence that says you have to have the consent of the governed, and maybe he smirked, maybe he was like, yeah, I don't really have to have the consent of the governed. But I would submit to you that I think Jefferson was right when he said that, because the thing is, if kings or queens mess up, they trample on your rights, they do things you don't want them to do, I mean, that's how revolutions are born, right? So, yeah, I think even monarchs have to have that consent of the governed. And in getting the consent of the governed, it's those people who have that right to vote. They're the ones who are going to have a say in that government, that society. So, again, as they're breaking away, they could have brought more people into that. They could have had more people who were, quote, the ones giving that consent. But they instead stayed with the adult white male property holders as the only ones with the right to vote. But there were some exceptions to that rule. After the Revolution, people who had served in the military, this isn't true of all the states, but in many of the states, they were given the right to vote. I remember in my research that New Jersey was a state, for example, where if you had served in combat during the American Revolution, they'd give you the right to vote. But I also came across instances where you could be an adult white male property holder, but like in Massachusetts, for example, Jewish men were not given the right to vote because of their religious backgrounds. They met all the other criteria. They were adult white males, they held property, they paid taxes, but because they were Jewish, they weren't allowed to vote there in Massachusetts. Okay, and this is the last point here. The revolution was about who governed, not how government should represent everyone. Yeah, our founding fathers, even as late as the Constitutional Convention, that's 7 years after the Treaty of Paris. 6 years after the Treaty of Paris, 1783, it was still just the adult white male property holders that had the right to vote. George Washington becomes our first president. They're still the only ones who have the right to vote. You get in through Thomas Jefferson as president of the United States, they're still mostly the only ones who have the right to vote. And it's really not till Andrew Jackson in the 1820s that you start to see other people being brought into that right to vote. So for it to be this idea that the revolution was about creating a democratic state, it's just not there, because 50 years after the fact, you still have mostly just adult white male property holders exercising that right to vote. Just a few quotes from some of those founding fathers, things that they had to say about this concept of democracy. For a lot of them, they called it mob rule. They hearkened back to the ancient times. The Greeks, the Romans, they talked about how any time a democratic state emerged, it didn't last long. At some point, the mob just took over. But here we have the father of our country, right? George Washington. Mankind, when left to themselves, are unfit for their own government. That doesn't sound like a guy who wants to give everybody the right to vote. Now, Thomas Jefferson's interesting in these moments of the revolution, a few years after the revolution. He's saying things like this, that democracy is nothing more than mob rule. But later when he's running for the presidency and he's essentially trying to take over the federal government in a sense, he starts talking more and more about how poor people should have the right, let me back that up, how poor white men should have the right to vote, and not just the wealthy white men of the age. But you're talking here about 51% can take away the rights of the other 49. That's not really supportive of democracy either. I think of all the founding fathers, the guy who really saw this as mob rule was Alexander Hamilton more than anyone else. I'd let you read that for yourself if you want there. But I know that Hamilton in his life was terrified of what democracy meant. He was terrified of the concept of mob rule. When you take American history, you'll probably learn about something called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was this instance in Massachusetts where dirt poor farmers in Massachusetts were upset about taxation. They were rebelling against the Massachusetts government. And as they sort of stormed across the state of Massachusetts, the Shays rebels were burning banks, they were burning courthouses. They were essentially destroying everything that adult white male property holders liked. Like banks is where they store their money, right? And courthouses are the rule of law. So when Hamilton saw what was happening under Shays' Rebellion, he said that's what happens when ignorant people are given power. They use that power to destroy banks, destroy courts, civilization itself. Later when things break out in France, when you get the French Revolution going, Alexander Hamilton was constantly talking about that's mob rule in action. That's what democracy looks like over there with the guillotines and the revolution in France and everything like that. So, a lot of these founding fathers were terrified of giving every person the right to vote. In many ways, they felt like it was safer with them, right? They're the property holders, they're the rich, they're the wealthy, they're the betters, as Jefferson would have called them. So it should stay with them. And I think that speaks to the power that the vote is, right? If you look throughout American history, there have been so many attempts to take away voting rights. In this age, it's just with the rich white guys. But even after all this, you get into Jim Crow America, where people are losing the right to vote, in those times. That right to vote is a very powerful thing. It really, truly is. And it's kind of crazy as you look through the past and history how there are so many moves to just take away that right, just to strip it away from certain groups of people because they knew how powerful that thing could be at the end of the day. Here's Adams talking about how it never lasts that long. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. These guys really don't see democracy as something that's long-lasting, good government. It's more like mob rule at the end of the day. Another guy who had a lot to say about it was Madison as well. Madison's nickname is the father of the Constitution. He had a lot to say about the drafting of the document, the Constitution itself. And in a series of papers that are called the Federalist Papers, he and Hamilton just really do a big job of destroying the concept of democracy, pounding away at this idea that it should be more of a representative republic than it should be a true out-and-out democracy. So there's Madison's ideas. Wow, I totally misspelled James Madison. There you go, that's my bad. James Madison feels this way about the concept of democracy. Okay, I guess some things that can kind of back up what I'm trying to say, the point that I guess I'm trying to make. Maybe I can spell my founding fathers a little better. But one thing that you look at is this indirect election of U.S. senators at the time. When the founding fathers set this up, this idea of a direct electing senators to the United States Senate, they were really terrified about what they called the passions of the people. That would have been like me and you, just everyday average people. And you see in a lot of the way the federal government is set up a fear of democracy and a fear of what mob rule maybe could do to the future of the country. U.S. senators forever, until the 17th Amendment was passed to the Constitution in 1913, forever and a day, the way we elected our U.S. senators was, so voters would vote, and for a long time it was just the adult white male property holders, but they would cast a vote. And one of the things they would vote for is the state legislature. So like the state of Virginia, these men would be elected and they would represent those adult white male property holders. They would gather together in assembly and they would do all manner of things. Pass taxes, select various laws. But another thing that they would do when the legislators met is that if it was that time that year, they would elect your U.S. senators as well. So we, the people, did not directly elect those senators. Our state legislators did that for us. That is a sign that the founding fathers felt like the United States Senate should be sort of, a cooling down area. Like the House of Representatives would be the passions of the people that would play out in sort of dramatic ways. But the Senate should be our betters, the more intelligent, the more calm, rational, and intelligent people should be in the United States Senate. So the fact that they weren't allowing we, the people, to directly elect those senators, it is a sign of a fear of democracy and what it could mean. You look at the way the U.S. Supreme Court, not necessarily how it's set up, but how you get there. Anyone want to take a crack? How does one become a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court? What do you got to do? You're appointed by the President of the United States, but there's another step in that, right? You're also confirmed by the United States Senate. Okay. So both the executive and the legislative, right, have a say in who's going to be, basically at the top of the judicial branch. But once you're on the Supreme Court, what's your term limit? How long do you stay there?
Lifelong.
What now?
Is it lifelong?
That is a lifelong commitment. You can retire, you can die, you can be found to have committed high treason against the United States. But yeah, that's a lifetime gig. And when the Founding Fathers talked about that process of putting these people on the bench as a lifetime commitment, again, they talked about the passions of the people. They talked about how they didn't want Supreme Court justices worrying about elections and having to sort of placate me and you. As I always tell my students, imagine there's a big case comes up before the Supreme Court. That never happens though, right? Big cases that cause the country to get into an uproar and we're all mad at each other. That would never happen, right? But imagine there's a case comes before the Supreme Court. I'm a justice sitting on the bench and I'm up for election this year. Imagine if it was an elected position. I know that this is a controversial thing. I know that whatever decision I hand down, there's a lot of people going to be upset about it. So I sit there and I say to myself, so to better my chances of getting elected, instead of doing what the Constitution says I ought to, I'm instead going to do this very popular thing that's going to win me votes and is going to get me back here. So the way that the Founding Fathers put these guys on the bench for a lifetime gig, that too demonstrates a bit of a mistrust of democracy, we the people, the passions that we can sometimes let out. Let's see, voting rights being left to the states. The states are more or less given that ability. Oh, I was told not to walk in front of the thing. Sorry, it messes up the recording there. The states are allowed that ability to decide who has that right to vote. And, I said earlier New Jersey gave people who had served in the military the right to vote. Other states had that option as well, but I think it's very telling that 1770s, 80s, 90s, 18-aughts, 1810s, they're just sticking with not a very democratic way of doing it. It's still just as the adult white male property holders who have that political power going on through those years. And there you go. All non-adult white male property holders, or all non-white male property holders were excluded from politics. I come back to the statement that I made earlier. I think it's really the thing that proves all this that I'm trying to say. They really could have changed the world. They really could have done, that is the Founding Fathers, they could have done about anything they wanted to do after July 4, 1776. But they stuck with what they trusted, and they stuck with what they knew, with the rich white guys being in charge, and being the only ones who had the right to vote. So at the end of all this, I would say that democracy was more of an unintended consequence of the revolution than an actual goal. And I really do want to preface this statement. I'm not getting up here bashing democracy. I'm not getting up here bashing our country. I'm really not. What I'm telling you just simply is the Founding Fathers did not have this as a goal of the revolution. They wanted to break away from British rule. In breaking away from British rule, they wanted to sort of maintain their control over the society that would emerge. But, you know, it's crazy that those rich white guys, they win the revolution. They go on to create a framework of a constitution, which really was adult white male property owners who were the ones who made that constitution. But in building that document, it's come over the ages to apply to all of us, right? Like, it took forever and a day. And in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, this is just me, I don't think you really have democracy in America till, say, the 1960s, maybe even the early 1970s. And that's like, what, 200 years after the American Revolution. So it was an unintended consequence of what those guys were trying to do. Okay, here's Benjamin Rush, another one of our founding fathers. I really like this statement. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. We're still living the American Revolution. It's still going on. We're still changing. We're still adapting with the times. And we still argue over who has the right to vote. We still have political arguments over people's right to vote being taken away in today's world. So yeah, the revolution never really ended. It's always been going. Truth be told, and it goes on even into today. And I think the last statement I hear is old Ben Franklin. There was a lady by the last name of Powell there in Philadelphia after the Constitutional Convention was coming to an end. She saw Ben Franklin on the streets. She walked over to old Ben, and she was just curious, and she said, well, Mr. Franklin, what type of government do we have? And he looked up at her and he responded, a republic, if you can keep it, which is kind of his way of saying, this could work. We do have this republic, but it's up to us, right, to, I don't know, safeguard it, protect it, and try to keep it going on into the future. Okay, I do have one more little myth to bust. It's not as involved as the democracy part was. But myth-busting this idea that all the colonists wanted independence, like that this was a majority opinion of the people who lived in the colonies. We want independence. We want to break away from the British Empire. That's not really true, being honest with you. Not all the colonists were really looking for independence from the British Empire. Okay, historian Robert Calhoun says that really the American Revolution was a civil war being waged within the British Empire. If you go back and you read what a lot of founding fathers had to say in 1774 and 1775, they were talking about fighting for their rights as Englishmen. You don't see that word American start to pop up until 1776. So when this revolution started, it really was about their rights as Englishmen being trampled upon through things like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act that had come before. Also the Coercive Acts. You got to talk about the Coercive Acts as well, being a part of that. So, I don't know. Like, my major professors at UNT, I remember them telling me these amazing stories about George Washington at night when he was getting ready to go to bed. He would stand by his bed and he had himself a little shot glass and some whiskey, which is funny because years later they tried to make George Washington out to be a teetotaler. That is to say, he didn't like alcohol. No, he liked alcohol. He had a distillery right there on the property. But George Washington would sit there, he'd put his shot glass, he'd fill it with a little whiskey, he'd look towards the east, towards London. I don't know if he was accurate, but he would just look that way. And he'd hold up his shot glass and he'd say, "To the health of His Majesty King George III. He'd take a shot and he'd set it down and he'd go to bed. He did that through 1775. So that's not really a guy looking for independence at that moment. Now, 1776 rolls around, you bet. He's on board. But he really wasn't looking for independence in 1775. Ben Franklin, that great American of the time, he was everything, a scientist, an inventor, a Renaissance man. He also ran a newspaper in Philadelphia. And you go back and you read some copies of his editorials, and Franklin went on and on and on about how proud he was to call himself an Englishman, how proud he was to exercise his rights as an Englishman. There had been a war that happened before all this. The French and Indian War came to an end in 1763. And you can go back and read Franklin's articles where he's talking about the victory, how proud he is. There's this patriotic just fervor that comes through in those editorials. And it's fascinating that those guys who were loyal to the British, toasting to the health of King George III, they're the ones who lead the charge against later on, right? They're the ones who break away and rebel. So I think Calhoun is onto something in saying that it was a civil war within the British Empire, but the Civil War, the whole tenor changes on July 4, 1776. Once you have a Continental Congress breaking away with the Declaration of Independence, at that point it's something different. Okay, it's not a civil war anymore, it's a war for independence as of July 4, 1776. Now, a guy who played a big role in getting the colonists to come around to this idea of independence is the fellow you see here. This is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is going to write a series of articles that later get published as a book called Common Sense. And in Common Sense, Thomas Paine is going to make an argument for why they should break away, why they should declare their independence. One thing that Thomas Paine talked about in Common Sense was he called King George III a tyrant. He said that he was a tyrant and he was undeserving of your love. I know this is a weird thing to say, but that was treasonous talk back then. That's like find a rope, get a tree, hang a man for saying something like that. And when Paine talked like that in the newspapers, it was kind of shocking. Like, you know, women were clutching their pearls. Like, my God, how could he say something like, you know, the king is a tyrant? And it sort of swirled around in people's minds that, like, God, that's such a shocking thing to say. But as 75 became 76, and the war was continuing, and it wasn't getting any better, and it was pretty obvious that it wasn't going to stop anytime soon, I think a lot of colonial people came around to this idea that, okay, I'm a loyalist, I support King George, I just want my rights as an Englishman, but maybe this Paine guy's onto something. This king, I got 5 minutes. I can work with that. I got 5 minutes. Okay, so yeah, he just basically made that case for independence. So now I got a rapid fire machine gun style. Okay, so he also talked about how, you know, you're a country already, you just haven't woke up to that fact. You come together in a Congress to meet, to discuss when your rights have been trampled upon. You make resources down south like cotton, rice, sugar. You have industry up north. You're a country, you just got to wake up to that fact, is what he was saying in the newspapers as well. And so as 75 became 76, the colonial people began to come around to that way of thinking that Thomas Paine was talking about in the newspapers. And again, it's hard to get that across in 2025. That was very controversial stuff that he was writing about in the newspapers, 75 to 76. So really for a lot of them, this war was about their rights as Englishmen, fighting to restore their rights as Englishmen against what they saw as British tyranny. But with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and then like the Declaration of Independence is a whole nother event. I can't do that in 3 minutes or whatever it might be. Yeah, you'll have to come back. Actually, we had a Declaration of Independence event previously, so you could watch the recording of that, I guess. All right, I was very proud of myself that I made a pie chart. Samantha outdid me. She actually put a movie clip in hers, but I'm very proud of my little pie chart. And really, honestly, it was about a 33-33-33 mix on July 4, 1776, as to whether or not to break away and declare independence. You had patriots, loyalists, neutral. I would say July 5, 1776, your neutral That's this one. And your loyalists, they're confused on July 5, 1776. Like, why would you give up this protection? Why would you give up these safeguards that the British Empire give us? The British protect the West, the frontiers, from possible Native American raids. They protect the coastlines with their navy. What are we doing here, guys? You know, why are we giving up all this protection and stability that we've had forever? But as the war continued on, and I don't have to, yeah. But as the war progressed and as victories started to mount and as the French joined into the crusade, Americans hate to hear this, but if we don't have the French, we probably don't win this thing. But as Americans start to win victories, your neutrals start to come around to the idea of there being America. Your loyalists start to realize the game's up. Either you get on board or you get the heck out of Dodge. I'll show you the one thing. About 70,000 loyalists left, realizing the game was up. So yeah, by war's end, most colonial Americans came around to that idea of independence. Yeah, so it really doesn't start out as this firm, we're all together in this to win it, sort of a thing. But as time rolls on, more and more people did come around to that idea of independence. And sorry if I went over on my time. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you. Samantha, you can.
All right, so as we transition from Professor Hathcock to Professor Elkins, I have a little bit of some American Revolution trivia for you. For a prize, of course. We are very generous here in the history department. So our Needle Arts Club, and if, by the way, you're interested in needle arts, we meet every Thursday from 2 to 4 in MBSS 1103, so come see us. If you don't know how to knit or crochet, we will teach you. So definitely come see us. But our Needle Arts Club made these wonderful and very patriotic stars, little squishies, so this is our prize. So the first question, and I'm just going to go, Cindy, you want to help me? I'm just going to go first person who raises their hand. First question, who was the first person to sign the U.S. Declaration of Independence? This is multiple choice, hold on. A, William Floyd, B, Francis Lightfoot Lee, C, Caesar Rodney, or D, John Hancock? All right. John Hancock, you've got it. Congratulations.
John Hancock. Everybody knows it's Herbie Hancock.
All right, second question. What was the name given to the American colonists who supported Great Britain during the American Revolution? Oh, I don't even have to give the multiple choice. Perfect. What's your answer? The Loyalists. Excellent. Very good. You got it? Oh, I underthrew. That was my fault. That was my fault. All right, question number 3. Which American Revolutionary officer was hanged in 1776 for spying on the British? Was it A, Thomas Hickey, B, Francis Marion, C, Nathaniel Greene, or D, Nathan Hale? What's your guess? D, Nathan Hale, yes. So he very famously says before his death, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. Very good. All right, one more, and then we'll do another set of trivia questions after Professor Elkins. So one more question. Which animal appears on the Revolutionary War flag with the legend, "Don't tread on me"? A snake, you got it. It's a snake, very good. Awesome, very good, guys. All right, so Professor Elkins is going to continue the discussion on myth versus reality in the American Revolution.
All right, I figured I'd jump up here. I was changing it up. I am Samantha Elkins, and I'm a history instructor here, and I'm going to be looking more at the individual stories from the Revolutionary War and everything. So the thing is, as historians, we don't really have a full picture of exactly what happened at any given time. I wish we did. That would make my job a lot easier. We tend to have incomplete or selective documentation, and this brings into play, some more oral traditions, and then in particular, some more artistic imagination. And we get, obviously, lots of inaccuracies with paintings and things like that. I'm not even going to tell you all the inaccuracies up here. Therefore, it really shouldn't be a surprise when looking at so many of the stories of the American Revolution that they have been confirmed as false, or at least stretching the truth. Don't get me started on this image. So if you're in my class, you know we talk about this extensively. Yet, these stories persist and oftentimes are still published in books and even in textbooks today. And so why do we have these stories that persist? Well, let's be honest, a lot of these stories are really almost more like a collective folklore in American history. And what they do is they give us a collective identity, which we've already been seeing a little bit before with my colleague. How cohesive was the American Revolution? We want it to be more cohesive than it really was. They also can be seen as giving us, they're patriotic and everything. Although if you've come to events that we've done in the past, then we know patriotism and nationalism, there's a fine line between it. And a lot of that line is about the truth, quite frankly. And then third, which is actually what I'm going to be looking at a lot more today, is they're just good stories. And a great example of like a great story to come out of the American Revolution is the story of Molly Pitcher. Really, I should say, the folklore of Molly Pitcher. She's a woman at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. She's bringing water to the gunners to help cool them down. Her husband falls in battle. But does she despair? No. She merely takes his place at the cannon. And then some versions of the story go on to say like, this inspires the men around her to fight even harder against those British. And some will talk about her being commended after the battle. Sometimes they even say like, George Washington himself commends her and everything like that. Which interestingly enough, we get this story being told by George Washington's, I guess technically adoptive grandson. It's not his actual biological grandson. He has no biological kids. Point is, literally telling this story, and it's supposed that Washington actually would tell him that version of the story. So Washington himself is, spreading this story and everything like that. And the thing is, it's a great story. There's adventure, there's tragedy, but it's a story about persistence, about overcoming the odds. It's a David and Goliath-esque story where a singular woman inspires the men to take on the insurmountable British Empire. It's that tie to the patriotic nature of the revolution that even the women hate the British so much, they're willing to take a place at a cannon and fight them themselves. They're willing to risk life and limb for the American cause. And make no mistake, it's very clear that she's a woman. They're very clear about that. A lot of the imagery of her, if you decide to Google search images of Molly Pitcher, sometimes her dress is torn open and like one of her breasts is bare to the audience, and it's very much like she is a woman. So it's making it clear that even the women want to fight the British and everything. It's once again about how all the American colonists, even though we just learned it wasn't really all of them, wanted to do their part. The problem is this entire thing is folklore. It's not reality. The reality isn't near as pretty of a story, and it's not nearly cohesive of a story. The reality is that Molly Pitcher is probably based off of numerous named and unnamed women in the American Revolution. The thing, like parts of it were like bringing water to the men on the battlefield, that was probably true of a lot of women who were camp followers when it came to battles. Specifics though, like of them fighting the enemy, there are a couple of specific women that this might have been lightly based off of. A great example of this is, and you'll see her name in textbooks, Mary Ludwig Hayes McCully. Yeah, I know that's a lot of last names. What we know about her is that she received a pension for services rendered and a private's half pay. We know she was present at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, although actually like who she was married to is really confusing because of all those last names that we don't really know which husband was there and which husband was dead, and not even going to get into that. So right there you got that incomplete documentation, not very helpful, quite honestly. And so people kind of fill in the gaps, and they actually do this more so after she already died. She's never celebrated in her lifetime. So this is kind of that incomplete history. Well, what about the women we might know more about? Well, that gets us to a much more kind of ugly version of the reality that Molly Pitcher might have been based off of. One woman that was present at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, which actually may have been Mary Ludwig Hayes McCully. Try saying that 10 times fast. She goes unnamed, but we have in 1830, so like over 50 years after the Revolutionary Wars happened, Joseph Plum Martin, who's pictured here and everything along with his wife, he shares a memory of seeing a woman with her husband on the battlefield at the Battle of Monmouth. And he says, and this is a direct quote, "While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step," so she's reaching for a cartridge, "a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away the lower part of her petticoat." I mean, this technically could happen. Cannonballs can bounce and everything like that. But like, okay. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed it was lucky it did not pass a little bit higher, for in that case it might have carried away something else and ended her in her occupation. You're allowed to laugh, it's dirty. It is. So, like I said, it's kind of the uglier version. On one side of this, she's the butt end of a dirty joke, which is probably one reason the guy either is telling the story like 50 years later or remembers the story 50 years later, which, that's a whole different thing. It definitely demonstrates how a lot of men would have viewed women at that time. Maybe not what we want to include in the story of the making up the foundation of America. But actually, it's also more realistic, because the thing is, the men in the military, like the ones who are on the ground, not like our officers that we normally picture and everything like that, they would have been crass, they would have been vulgar, they would have drank, they would have swore, and frankly, the women would have been cut of the same cloth. But it's also really telling that this is one of the few verifiable sources we have about a woman fighting on the battlefield during the Revolutionary War, who was clearly a woman and not a woman in disguise as a man. Yeah, and you can also see how it has very little in common with the folklore, right? Which is more telling to us what we wanted to remember, what we wanted to cherish, what makes a good story, and specifically what makes a good heroine, when sharing this story with friends and family and children and grandchildren, maybe not the G-rated version, obviously, with right here. and especially when we're forging the identity of America. There is also one other woman that it might have been based off of, because keep in mind, this one might actually be Mary Ludwig Hayes. We don't know. They might have been the same. They were both at the same battle. But it could have also been based off of Margaret Corbin. She's not the most polished protagonist either. We do know she did stand in for her husband, John, who had just been killed during the Battle of Fort Washington in November of 1776. So this is earlier in the war. So we do know, okay, so she took the place of her husband. So that's nice. However, while she is fighting, she would lose the use of her arm because it was wounded so badly. Literally, the arm was almost completely severed from her body, which is not really the images that we just saw a few slides back. So not a pretty picture. And she had bad scarring that she would have for the rest of her life in other places. Also know that the position that she was helping to defend was actually overran by the British. And it was the British doctors that actually helped her heal in the aftermath. So already we are starting to see a picture of why maybe some of her specifics might not be included in our folklore of Molly Pitcher and everything. We do know that Margaret Corbin, though, was awarded by the Supreme Council of Pennsylvania a lifetime pension that would be considered 1/2 the monthly pay drawn by a soldier. But actually, more of the documents that talk about Margaret Corbin after the war's over talk about her being like really crass and that she drank a lot. And that being said, like she took up the nickname Captain Molly for the rest of her days. That's what she called herself. Of course, her other nickname was Dirty Kate, and she died of syphilis. So the thing is, Margaret Corbin's kind of the reality, while Molly Pitcher is the folklore. You can see why Corbin's story isn't published in textbooks, and it doesn't become the story repeated for future generations. She's crass, she's vulgar, she's wounded. It doesn't make for the greatest imagery. She's also not really ever celebrated in her lifetime. In fact, when you talk about kind of the publishing and the idea of Molly Pitcher, more of those kinds of stories actually come out in like the 1830s rather than during the Revolution itself. And keep in mind, when you're talking about stories talking about the past, a lot of times they're actually more a reflection of the time period they come out in than about the past. If you've ever attended one of our movie discussions, I'll do a shameless plug here. We do movie discussions every other week. This week is Terminator, come see it. And then we discuss it and everything. But a lot of times, one element of it, when we're even looking at history movies that are about historical events, which that's not Terminator, but could be. No, and the thing is, what we see oftentimes is that the movie might be about the past, but on some level it's making commentary about the present day that it came out in. That it's about the present on some level as well as the past. And when you're talking about the present in 1830s America, well, that's the time period that a lot of the founding fathers and mothers and the people who had served in the American Revolution and remembered it directly, they've been dying off for the last decade or two. And so a lot of it's about capturing the memory of the revolution or the perceived memory of the revolution. And of course, what make the best stories, the most heroic stories of sacrifice, but an acceptable amount of sacrifice. We don't want dangling limbs and things like that, because we got to tell our children and our grandchildren about this. And a lot of it's about kind of American exceptionalism and individualism that are things that we love to talk about from a historic standpoint. when you're talking about Americans' identity over time. In fact, actually, the idea of folklore really being more commentary on the day that it's written or spoken about can be actually seen even more so with Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Oh, this is also, I missed us changing a slide. Right in 1830, when they talk about Molly Pitcher and everything, turns out there was actually a woman who took the place out of Cannon in Spain, and like literally everything's like very heroic. She's the last woman standing. It inspires the troops to come back and fight off Napoleon and all that stuff. They're later overrun like 6 months later. She is celebrated in her life, and so it's, oh, what a surprise. We also get that story around the same time. So interesting. Yeah, so Paul Revere's Ride. If you know nothing else about Paul Revere's Ride, you probably know the opening lines to Longfellow's poem. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I'm not going to say the whole poem. It's a long poem. I'm not doing that. And that's the thing, is so much about Paul Revere's ride to warn the Americans of the British coming to attack is really more based off of this poem than the reality of what happened. A lot of times the story that we get from Longfellow of the lone rider, you know, who's going to issue the wake-up call for all Americans to take up arms against the incoming British, that the entire fate of the nation rested in the hands of just one man, Paul Revere. The poem really makes it out like he is responsible for everything that will come out of this. That, you know, oh, Paul Revere's riding by himself. Even the lanterns in the poem seem to be his idea. He like instructs the other unnamed person in the poem to like, oh, go do that. He then goes on to visit every Middlesex village and farm. He warns that the British are coming. Technically, the poem never says he shouts the British are coming, but let's be honest, that's what everybody knows. The British are coming, the British are coming. It's another David and Goliath story. One lone man against the great British Empire and everything. Yeah, the reality of what happened that night, according to Paul Revere himself and other sources, really is that we get this one guy, Dr. Joseph Warren, sending him to ride to Lexington with a message to Samuel Adams and John Hancock. With a number of soldiers seem to be headed in that direction. He then is able to cross the Charles River. He has to evade some British officers, which he's warned about actually by Dr. Joseph Warren. He rides to Lexington, and at that point he alarms both Adams and Hancock. I keep trying to say Hathcock. This does not help me. We also know Dr. Joseph Warren would send out a second messenger, William Dawes, along a different route just in case. The whole lantern signals were a backup beyond that was supposed to be a signal in case like Paul Revere couldn't get out of the city of Boston. Later reports would show there was at least 4 riders, if not more, that were sent out directly just in case. So there was backups upon backups upon backups. And in fact, Paul Revere, after giving the warning, he decides, oh, I'm going to move on to Concord and warn them too. And then he's captured by the British, 2 British officers, who basically hold him at gunpoint all night, threatening to kill him. Literally, they threatened to like shoot off his head and stuff the whole night. Confiscate his horse and let him go. Paul Revere, when he actually talks about what happened to him, he's like, yeah, I had made tons of trips before. I had practiced this before. I had sent information many, many times, and this was probably the most dangerous situation he was ever in. So like for him, the climax of the story was the being captured, not the ride. that was like a footnote. On foot, he did head back to Lexington. Supposedly, he heard the first shots fired, though he didn't know who shot first, so they didn't even like talk about that in a lot of official documentation. In fact, a lot of early notations about the riders sending out messengers and just these messengers in general, they never talk about Revere by name in any of this documentation. In fact, more of them talked about Dr. Warren, because he's the one who's a lot more aware of the patrols, and he's helping with sending out the messengers and everything like that. Now, Revere's ride was kind of known in his community, and people would commend him for it like his whole lifetime, and it was kind of one of those stories that the children and the grandchildren of his community would be like, oh, tell us the story again, and everything like that, which is probably what led to what happened next. Jeremy Belknap, who was the secretary of the Massachusetts Historical Society, would ask Revere to give an account of his famous ride, and Revere did this. And then he signs it, a son of liberty in the year 1775. And he says, please don't publish my name. I don't need that. And Belknap is like, And he publishes the piece in 1798 with Revere's name, which we're pretty sure that's the documentation that Longfellow stumbles upon and where he gets Revere's name for his famous poem. So keep in mind, like when Revere dies in like 1818, like nobody really talks about the ride he made. They talk about other things. I mean, that image of the Boston Massacre, like he was the silversmith, like that and everything like that. They talked more about that stuff. And yet, his name is known in so many textbooks. People always know. I mean, we call it not just the Midnight Ride. We're like, no, it's the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But there's so many issues in it. It's not the truth of what happened. He wouldn't have shouted the British are coming, because they were British themselves. And first of all, so he might have warned like the regulars out, probably wouldn't have shouted it and everything like that. And keep in mind, technically there were already British officers in random places. It was more just more of them are coming. Be aware. He also doesn't visit many places at all. Certainly not every single town and village in Middlesex. And then the whole lantern thing, while it happened, it was a backup. It wasn't about signaling to Paul Revere at all, although I do have to then have my little gif that makes fun of it. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. They've double-crossed us. They're coming by land and sea. So this is almost as accurate as the lanterns being warning Paul Revere, because that's not what happened. And honestly, the biggest problem is that Revere didn't do it alone. You had so many other people organizing this, backup plans upon backup plans, like I've already mentioned. They've practiced it in advance, like they'd had dress rehearsals basically for this ride. And so many people were involved in the ideas and everything leading to this moment. So why does this story persist? Well, first of all, the story is more of a David and Goliath story. And once you start doing the truth and there's a lot more people involved in it, it takes away from that American individualism and exceptionalism that we love to identify. We like the lone rider mentality. Also, one of the reasons people like the story of Paul Revere so much is oddly because who Revere was, or really who he wasn't. He's not a statesman. He's not a lawyer. In many ways, he's considered like an ordinary man of the American colonies. He's more relatable to a lot of people. People didn't know his name before Longfellow's poem, which in a way makes him more heroic. It's the idea that anyone, even the most ordinary person, could hold the key for turning the tide of the war. Okay, they weren't really in the war yet, but you get what I mean. That's what makes it a great story. It's inspiring, and that is what Longfellow was trying to do. He was really trying to inspire the people of America more than actually write a good, true historical account of what happened on this night. He wrote about Paul Revere's ride in 1860 when America is literally on the verge of the Civil War. Longfellow himself was a pacifist and an abolitionist, and so he's trying to connect the past with the present events at the time. So there's one section I do want to read of Longfellow's poem to you guys that he's describing this, trying to inspire the people, and he's like, it's a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. It's meant to be a wake-up call to Americans, a stirring, poetic reminder of America's roots with the Revolution, even though it's more of a roots, during that time period that Longfellow is living through, a time of peril, that people might hear this poem and remember the revolutionary ideals, even though they're more myth than reality, as we've seen. But the idea is that ordinary actions of people stood up for what was right, and that this should inspire people in Longfellow's time to basically do the same. I have to mention that the poem was published in January of 1861, so he wrote it in 1860, but it's published in 1861 in January. The Civil War breaks out in April of 1861. And we do see that during the Civil War, America's identity as a nation and our collective history and memory is being reforged all over again. So in the end, what Longfellow wrote was meant to be inspiring, even if it didn't actually stop the Civil War from happening. For many, it did inspire them. It's been related in like speeches by MLK later on and things like that. That we see it how, as a story, it persists today, often causing the true history to actually be forgotten. But I'm a historian. I want to know the truth. And the truth of much of the Revolutionary War is it's ugly, it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's confusing. It had many characters, people in it. All of which makes it harder to understand. And thus leads to a sort of rewriting of history in favor of what we wanted it to be. And thus how a lot of these myths are born. One of my favorite lines on how you look at the history of the Revolution and looking at like myths and everything like that comes from Ray Raphael, who wrote, and I quote, "To remember their revolution, the people who lived through it first had to learn to forget." And the thing is, this happens over years and years and decades, and we can really still say in many ways our history is still being rewritten and reevaluated and reinterpreted, there we go, constantly with every new generation. So when John Adams wrote to one Thomas McKean in 1815, "Who shall write the history of the American Revolution?" Who can write it? Who will ever be able to write it? My answer would be, in many ways, that's still to be determined. And that is where I end.
All right, thank you, Professors Hathcock and Elkins. And thank you all for coming. Don't leave yet. Thank you all for coming and hearing a little bit about the American Revolution, myth versus reality. So last couple of questions. Where did General George Washington and his army spend the winter of 1777 through 1778? Somebody who hasn't answered yet. Let's spread the wealth. Somebody who hasn't answered yet. Yes. Valley Forge. Very good. Awesome. Which American naval officer during a naval engagement with the British said, "I have not yet begun to fight"? Was it Dudley Saltonstall, Thomas Reed, John Hazelwood, or John Paul Jones? Is there somebody else? No one? Oh, right there. Who? John Paul Jones. Yes, very good. Oh, in the striped. Cindy, right back there. Sorry. Who served for 4 years as aide-de-camp to George Washington? We all know this guy because he has a whole stinking musical about him. You've got it. Say it louder. Over here. Say it louder. You got it. Oh, you had it. Yeah. Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. Yes. Which act stating that the British Parliament's taxing authority was the same in America as in Great Britain was passed after the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766? Was it the Enclosure Act, the Libel Act, the Appropriation Act, or the Declaratory Act? The Declaratory Act, yes. And finally, grand prize, the Blue Star. The Blue Star. There's one. Oh, okay, we should get this. Who was the British American writer whose political pamphlet Common Sense influenced the American Revolution? Yeah, go with this one. Do you know who it is? Thomas Paine, there you go. All right, before you leave, if you want to grab a drink in the back on your way, feel free to do so. And Samantha, you want to pass out, you forgot to do it. Pass out the evaluation, please click on that and fill out that evaluation for us. Thank you for coming and have a wonderful rest of your day.